Hi everyone, Valharik here, and I wanted today to take a look at Mistover, and more specifically, Mistover compared to Darkest Dungeon. So Mistover is a turn-based strategy, roguelike, game with, a very similar setup to Darkest Dungeon, but I want to look at the differences and the similarities. So this just came out on Steam, and I'll look at the things that are similar to Darkest Dungeon first. So, just like Darkest Dungeon, it's a repeatable mission-based kind of turn-based strategy / RPG with minimal storyline. There is a storyline, but it's more focused on repeatedly doing missions and increasing your character and your whole mercenary corps, increasing their power and getting further into the game in that way, rather than reading lots of dialogue and that kind of thing. Similar to Darkest Dungeon, both of them have a little bit of story in the back, but it's not the main focus. So one thing you notice immediately when you start playing is that you have a roster of characters. That's very similar to Darkest Dungeon. There's permadeath, so if my paladin Pendragon here gets killed, I can probably go back in and recruit a new replacement paladin with similar skills, transfer over my equipment. That's all very similar to Darkest Dungeon. Combat is grid-based. You can see on the right side there where it lists off this character's different skills they can use during combat. And you can see the white dots on the left side show which columns the character has to be in to use those powers, and then the red and green dots show either which spots on the enemy board if it's red, or which spots on the player's side of the board it affects if it's green. And it's not real easy to see, but if you look closely, if you look at that defensive posture 1, the sixth one down, you can see that those spots are linked. That's going to show that that ability hits your whole team. If I look at like Bomb Toss here for the Shadow Blade, it's linked but only in vertical columns, so that's going to hit one column rather than the entire enemy team. Invisible Throw is going to hit one row instead of the entire enemy team. So there's potentially a little bit more depth in the combat than Darkest Dungeon, because what you can see there is you're playing on a battlefield that is made up of a 3x3 grid for friendly characters and a 3x3 grid for enemy characters. So it is grid-based combat with skills that depend on where you're standing, where your opponents are standing, but it's not exactly the same as Darkest Dungeon. It's a little bit more evolved, I would say. And then another thing to note that's different is you can see those bottom 3 abilities that this Shadow Blade has show another character's portrait before the name. That's showing that they have a link, a combo attack basically. It's similar to, you can see that this kind of has an anime JRPG look to it. You see that a lot in JRPGs where there's combo attacks and stuff. So for instance, this shadow casting, give all party members a 25% damage reflection buff, but it requires you to have a paladin in front of your shadow blade to be able to even use that ability. So that's a little bit, again, not so much, well, it is different than Darkest Dungeon, but it's like taking Darkest Dungeon's combat to the next level, I would say. If you look at the theme, I don't want to spoil the little bit of story that's in this one, but it's similar to Darkest Dungeon in that it's kind of gloomy. You know, you're at the verge of the world being destroyed, and you need to venture out and try and, you know, push back the darkness. I haven't actually gotten that far in the game. This is, I think I'm about to fight like the first boss. So I've probably played, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours. So the theme is similar in that you can see kind of, you have this town hub with different locations to go into. That's similar to Darkest Dungeon. You've got your recruiting area, you've got a place to train up your skills, a place to advance your weapons, that kind of stuff. So that is similar in Darkest Dungeon in how it's laid out, but how you actually do those things is different. Darkest Dungeon, to go up in skills, you basically just have to level up your characters and then you buy the skills you want. Whereas in this game, you go up levels, you get skill points, but then you can see each character has a longer list of abilities than Darkest Dungeon, and you can only use 4 of them at a time. You know, similar to Darkest Dungeon, you're selecting which ones you're gonna use at any one time. But to unlock the other ones, you have to, the ones that you didn't start with the abilities that you start with are randomized, and to unlock the other basic abilities, you have to have another character with that ability that you then can have basically teach your existing character that skill, and that other character is going to disappear, and instead your character that you leveled up is going to gain that skill. You can also just spend skill points to level up abilities that you've already got. So like I have this Overflowing Love 2, I've leveled that up once and increased the amount that it healed, increased my hit chance with it and my crit chance with it. So that's pretty, you know, similar to Darkest Dungeon. Once you have a skill, you can just put points into it to level it up. These combo abilities, it appears you get them every few levels automatically when you go up. So that's something that's completely new compared to Darkest Dungeon. You didn't have abilities like that you just got when you went up levels. Next, one thing that differentiates this from Darkest Dungeon, that is something that I kind of like, is each character class, so like this is a sister, kind of your healer, has a skill or ability that they can use while adventuring on the dungeon maps. So for instance, the healer here while moving during exploration, healing power increased 200. So as you move around the board in this game, you slowly heal and gain mana back, essentially. And so she buffs that up. These cost food, which as you play through each mission, you're constantly using food with every step you take. And if you use these hero abilities, they'll drain food, so you've got some resource management to do there. And then, one thing that is very similar here to Darkest Dungeon is you've got these quirks or traits that are random, and they can be good or bad, that you'll get occasionally as you go up levels. And then there's also a place to go and spend money to convert them into a new random one. So like I've got this slow if crewing back, when the light level is low, my speed decreases when someone's behind me. It's not great, but it's not end of the world. I kind of like having my healers be slow so that I take a little damage before their turn pops up. So that's very similar to Darkest Dungeon, but again, it's not something that has never been done in a game before Darkest Dungeon either. Lots of RPGs have quirks that are positive and negative. So I don't think that's enough to say that it's a dungeon or a Darkest Dungeon clone right off the bat. There's lots of other, common RPG elements that are the same, similar stats, your to hit, your chances for having special abilities proc, or, resistant, percent chances to resist enemies' effects. That stuff is very similar to Darkest Dungeon in this game, but it's not like it's revolutionary in the RPG turn-based strategy genre to begin with. So again, I don't think that's terribly telling that this is a pure Darkest Dungeon clone. You also have limited inventory in missions, so unlike Darkest Dungeon, when you obtain items, you can bring them back here to town and store them. And then when you go into the dungeon, which I'll just step into the dungeon here. When you step into the dungeon, you can only bring, a certain amount of stuff. And as you collect stuff in the mission, you can only bring out a certain amount of stuff. So, let's see here. Change formation. I'll just bring this one I've already got in. Bring some food. Bring some seeds. That's basically your torches. So that's pretty similar. You've got food you've got to maintain. You've got a light level that you got to maintain, although I don't feel the light is as big a part of this game as Darkest Dungeon. Darkest Dungeon, enemies get tougher, treasure gets better when the light changes. This essentially just affects your view radius. So I'll bring these guys into this dungeon. Bring this high level people into this dungeon. So let me quickly put in some lower level. Actually, I don't have a lot of lower level people. Maybe if I just don't bring in my level 4 or level 5s. Let's see what it says. Alright. Let's see if it yells at me again. Yes. Well, I don't want to fight the boss yet in this fight, so I'm just going to do this. So, we've kind of gone over most of the things that are pretty similar. This is going to look different than Darkest Dungeon. If you remember, Darkest Dungeon has... essentially, you're going from node to node, and you move into a room, you possibly encounter something there, or you're going down a hallway that's just a side scroller. It might have some curios or some monsters pop up. But there's limited strategy, I would say, in the exploration in Darkest Dungeon. Whereas in this game, you're plopped into a dungeon that you can go any direction you want. You'll have to come back, you know, because you'll see chests that you don't have keys for. It's just a different different exploration style. So you can see as I step, I'm losing food, I'm losing light. Monsters pop up and they'll either chase you or attempt to run away from you. So you want to... it's similar to like a roguelike. You have to be careful with your movement. You're moving one step at a time, and you don't want a monster to move on top of you. You want to move on top of it, so you have the initiative advantage. So I'll start a fight here. You can see the battlefield. Got skills I'm using. Summon a little paper turtle that will sit there and taunt the enemies. Taunting, you know, is in this game. It's not super effective from what I've seen. Let's see. One thing, you have to target enemies, so like this cross blast looks like it would be perfect for this situation where they're, you know, top, middle, bottom, middle, and then right side, center, but I can't target that square in between the guys, so it's not quite as flexible as I'd like it to be. I didn't really talk about equipment, but if I look at one of these guys, Darkest Dungeon, each person has like 2 inventory slots, and they just are mostly occupied by kind of accessories. You do get occasional character-specific items that maybe look like a weapon or something, but they generally are just stat boosters. Well, this, you've got 4 inventory slots per character. You've got a weapon and armor, and then 2 accessory spots. So weapons are all going to give you attack bonuses, and then usually like hit and critical, but they could have other additional bonuses added on. Armor's generally going to give you hit points, evasion, and I don't know what the probably guard, I guess. The GRD is like a defensive take less damage ability. So I'm guessing I was racking my brain trying to figure out what GRD stood for. I haven't played a lot of JRPGs lately, so it wasn't coming to me, but I'm sure it's guard now that I look at it. And then, you know, rare armors have extra, and epic armors have even more stats. And where you see that third line there, it says number of fusions, 1 out of 6. So I can fuse armor that I'm no longer going to use into this armor to make it better. And basically everything's like that. The normal stuff, you can't fuse as many. You can fuse, 6 pieces into these rare ones. You can fuse 9 into the epics I've seen. Only 1 or only 3 into normal items, so that's a little bit different. But in general, the combat's it's different. It's not really like Darkest Dungeon, other than you are using abilities that are somewhat similar to Darkest Dungeon, and then how they your positioning matters is very much like Darkest Dungeon, and also Warsaw if you're looking at my Warsaw videos. You saw a comment about the Doomsday Clock. So this game, there's a Doomsday Clock that I believe if it ever hits midnight, you lose the campaign. I haven't gotten that far to know for sure, but depending on how well you do in these missions, it can go up or down. Most of the time I think it'll stay flat, but if you really explore like the whole map, open all the chests, kill all the monsters, even find all of the like just little things to junk piles basically to search. If you do all those, you can get it to notch back 1 space in the favorable direction. So that is not something that's really in Darkest Dungeon. In Darkest Dungeon, you can just keep going until your people die, essentially. I don't know how big a factor it is in this, but because I haven't gotten far enough. But it's there. And then one other thing I like about the 3x3 grid space, instead of having a 4x1 that Darkest Dungeon has, is if you want a real tanky group, you can bring 3 frontline people and have only 2 people in the back, because all of the abilities, it doesn't matter what row you're on for the friendly ones, it just matters what column you're in. So for instance, I could, if I wanted to have a bunch of people that needed to be in like the front 2 spots, you can do that in this. Whereas Darkest Dungeon, you're somewhat limited in that you can only bring, one person that has abilities that need to be in that front line. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to use them. So that gets basically through most of the things in this game that are either similar or very different. The Darkest Dungeon, a big factor in it is sanity, which you don't have in this. All you have is hit points. So you don't have that extra thing you're trying to maintain. And when you get back to town in this game, other than your equipment that you gained and your levels you've gone up, there's no carryover really of bad things that happen. Well, the Doomsday Clock too, or permadeath. But there's no, my person's gone crazy, I've got to have them sit out for a mission or 2 before I can bring them back in. So you don't need as deep a roster, I don't think, in this game. There's, I want to say, 9 character classes. So really, I intend to pretty much play through with just 9 main characters that I will occasionally have to replace if somebody dies, or I may have to, hire somebody to gain a skill that I didn't have before. So I'm just going to show you here the leader abilities. So like I've got 2 enemies coming up on me here. I was just in a battle, and really I'm not in bad shape because these battles are pretty easy for this guy, but or this team. But say I really didn't want to fight these guys. It's late in the scenario. I'm out of healing, whatnot. I want to get out of jail here, basically. I can have this witch character use her time stop, which will basically stop movement for all the enemies for 4 turns and teleport me to a random location to get out of there. That's kind of cool. And each of the 9 different characters have a different one of those. So I can run around here. Let's just go up this way. Ran into a fight. So there's things on the map that you need to break through to advance. So like the paladin has an ability that she'll smash all those items. Otherwise, you can get through them without a paladin, but it takes... all your characters take damage if they do. The healer makes it so that, as you walk, you regenerate mana and food faster. Like normal. This guy makes... there are trap spots basically on the board. He illuminates them, although you can already see them at least in the maps that I've played. But he allows you to potentially disarm those traps. The witch I just showed you, the Reaper, will kind of show for a certain number of turns all of the like interactable objects on the map, even if it's in the fog of war. The let's see who's left. The Ronin's is kind of cool because he will basically charge in one direction as far as he can go until he runs into something, and then he stuns himself for 1 turn. So you gotta be a little careful not to like run into a place with enemies and then get stunned. The rogue, Shadow Hunter or something, I don't remember exactly what she's called. She makes you hide for like 15 spaces or until you interact with something, so you can get away from enemies. Similar but different to the witch's time stop. The werewolf, I've never used his, but I think it's a howl that draws in enemy, the enemies moving around the dungeon floor. So, if you're trying to fight enemies, you can basically pull them into you. And there's one more character I think that I'm forgetting. I don't remember. So, anyway, bottom line, you probably can tell from how I've been talking that I feel while there are similarities, I think this game's going to appeal to a very similar crowd as Darkest Dungeon, unless you are turned off by like kind of the anime feel of it. It's very similar, but it's not a clone. You know, anybody that is adamant at saying that this is a Darkest Dungeon clone, it's a different experience. I don't feel... It feels more like a JRPG than it does that kind of atmospheric, odds are always against me. Now, I've seen some people say that they think this game is tough, similar to Darkest Dungeon. I've had one character die because I was a little aggressive, you know? I ran out of food. Once you run out of food, you just start draining health. And I was a couple spaces away from the exit, and that person died before I got there. But I could have just left. I could have ran and lost, you know, I think you don't get as much reward if you bail on a mission rather than reach the exit. So it doesn't feel as extreme as Darkest Dungeon, at least not in my view. But I recommend trying it out. It has a demo I think you can download off Steam. The demo, I didn't download it, but I watched, you know, somebody else play it before I bought the game on YouTube, and it scared me a little bit seeing the demo because it had like a timer, and I don't really like games that have a timer counting down as you play. I like to think about my actions, so that turned me off. But I ended up, you know, watching somebody play the full version, and I haven't seen any timer yet, so I think that's good. Anyway, try it out. I think it's like $30 on Steam. It's not a revolutionary game or anything, you know, that you need to run out and get. So maybe you wait for a Steam sale or whatnot, but I've enjoyed it a lot. I like kind of the anime look to everything. The voice acting and everything is in Japanese, so I don't have any clue what they're saying, but it's well done, I think. Anyway, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe. I'll probably put maybe a playthrough. I've talked a lot about how the game already plays, so I may not do like a first impressions video. This kind of is like a first impressions video. So, yeah, I'll leave you with that. Anyway, have a good day. See you later.